In 1885, as another brutal winter loomed over the Stara Planina mountains, villagers feared a repeat of the deadly cold that had drained their firewood and claimed their weakest. Among them was Stefan, a young master builder whose family had shaped the village's stone and clay homes for nearly a century. But this year, the old ways wouldn't be enough. Firewood was scarce, temperatures were falling, and many feared they wouldn't survive another season. So, Stefan set out to rethink everything he'd been taught. Studying centuries-old houses, he realized the secret wasn't more fuel, it was thermal mass. Thick clay and stone walls could act like a giant heat battery, soaking up the sun by day and releasing warmth through the long Balkan nights. But he pushed the idea further, crafting a new solar clay, experimenting with charcoal mixes, deep foundations, and massive south-facing windows to turn humble village homes into passive heating machines. By winter's peak, his design was keeping families warm with a fraction of the wood they once needed. How did one builder transform a struggling mountain village into a model of low-fuel survival and rewrite the future of Balkan architecture? Part 1. The year is 1885. The place is a small, remote village nestled in the heart of the Stara Planina mountains, a rugged, unforgiving landscape that straddles the border between Serbia and Bulgaria. The village, a cluster of stone and clay houses clinging to the mountainside, is a world away from the burgeoning cities of Belgrade and Sofia. Here, life is governed by the rhythms of the seasons, the cycles of planting and harvesting, the ancient traditions that have been passed down through generations. It is late autumn, a time of transition, of preparation for the long, harsh winter that lies ahead. The air is crisp, the sky a brilliant cloudless blue. The leaves of the beech and oak trees that cover the lower slopes of the mountains have turned to a fiery palette of red, orange, and gold. The villagers are busy, their movements a symphony of purpose and precision. The men are in the fields, harvesting the last of the corn and potatoes. The women are in the courtyards, preserving fruits and vegetables, making cheese, spinning wool. The children are everywhere, their laughter echoing through the narrow, winding streets of the village. But there is an undercurrent of anxiety in the air, a sense of foreboding that hangs over the village like a shroud. The previous winter had been one of the harshest in living memory. The snow had come early on October 10th, 1884, and it had stayed late, not melting until the end of April. The temperatures had plunged to 30 degrees below freezing, and the wind had howled for weeks on end. The villagers had been trapped in their homes, their meager supplies of firewood dwindling with each passing day. Many had fallen ill, and some, the old and the very young, had not survived. This year, the signs are not good. The summer had been unusually dry, the harvest less bountiful than in previous years. The price of firewood, which had to be brought in from the forests on the other side of the mountain, had doubled. The villagers, who were already struggling to make ends meet, were now facing the prospect of a winter without enough fuel to heat their homes. In the center of the village, in a small two-story house built of stone and clay, a young man named Stefan is wrestling with this problem. At 30, Stefan is a master builder, a man who has inherited the skills and the knowledge of his father and his grandfather before him. Born on March 18, 1855, in this very house, he had learned the craft from his father, Dmitri, who had been the village's master builder before him. His grandfather, Nicola, had built the first stone houses in the village back in 1798, when the area was still under Ottoman rule. The family had a long, proud tradition of building, a tradition that went back generations, a tradition that was woven into the very fabric of the village. He is a man of the mountains, his body lean and hard, his hands calloused from years of working with stone and wood. He is a man of few words, a man who prefers the quiet solitude of his workshop to the boisterous camaraderie of the village tavern. Stefan is a man of deep thought, a man who is not content to simply follow the old ways. He is a man who is always looking for new ways to improve, to innovate, to make life better for his family and his community. And now, as the threat of another harsh winter looms, he is consumed by a single, all-encompassing obsession: to find a way to build a house that can stay warm with almost no fuel. He has spent the past few months, from July 15th to October 20th, 1885, studying the traditional houses of the village. On July 18th, he had measured the walls of the old Petrovic house, built in 1802, finding them to be 55 centimeters thick. On August 3rd, he had examined the Jovanovic house, built in 1825, noting its excellent preservation despite being over 60 years old. On August 22nd, he had studied the thermal properties of the Markovich house, built in 1847, recording interior temperatures of 18 degrees Celsius when the exterior was 32 degrees. On September 10th, he had analyzed the construction techniques of the Stoyanovich house, built in 1863, documenting the precise mixture of clay, sand, and straw used in its walls. He has measured their walls, he has analyzed their construction, he has observed the way they respond to the changing seasons. He has learned that the houses, with their thick, massive walls of stone and clay, are designed to do two things: to keep the heat out in the summer and to keep the heat in the winter. The walls, which are often more than half a meter thick, are a marvel of vernacular engineering. They are built of a composite material, a mixture of stone, clay, and straw that has been used in the Balkans for centuries. The stones provide the structural strength, the clay provides the thermal mass, and the straw provides the tensile strength, holding the mixture together and preventing it from cracking. The principle behind the design is simple: thermal mass. The thick, heavy walls of the house act like a giant thermal battery, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly at night. In the summer, the walls absorb the heat of the sun, keeping the interior of the house cool and comfortable. In the winter, the walls absorb the heat from the fire in the central hearth and from the bodies of the people and the animals and radiate it back into the living space, keeping the house warm even when the fire has died down. But Stefan has also learned that the traditional design has its flaws. The houses are often dark and damp, with small windows that let in little light. The walls, while effective at storing heat, are also slow to heat up. It can take several days of continuous fire to bring a cold house up to a comfortable temperature, and in a winter like the last one, when firewood is scarce, this is a luxury that the villagers cannot afford. Stefan is convinced that there must be a better way. He has read about new building techniques, new materials, new ideas that are being developed in the cities. He has heard stories of houses that are heated by the sun, of houses that are so well insulated that they need almost no fuel to stay warm. He has even seen a picture of a house in Germany, a house with large, south-facing windows that capture the heat of the winter sun. He is determined to apply these new ideas to the traditional houses of his village. He is determined to find a way to combine the ancient wisdom of his ancestors with the new knowledge of the modern world. He is determined to build a house that is not just a shelter from the storm, but a machine for living, a machine that can harness the power of the sun and the earth to create a warm, comfortable, and sustainable home. His obsession has not gone unnoticed. The other villagers, who have always respected him for his skill and his knowledge, are now beginning to question his sanity. They see him spending hours in his workshop, poring over books and drawings, muttering to himself about thermal mass and solar gain. They see him experimenting with new materials, new mixtures of clay and straw, new ways of building walls. They see him as a man who is turning his back on the old ways, a man who is dabbling in things that he does not understand. Even his own wife, Elena, is beginning to worry. She sees the fire in his eyes, the passion in his voice, but she also sees the toll that his obsession is taking on him. He is not sleeping, he is not eating, he is consumed by his work. She is afraid that he is chasing a dream that will never come true. But Stefan is not deterred. He is a man on a mission, a man with a vision. He is a man who believes that he can make a difference, that he can change the world, one house at a time. And as the first snows of winter begin to fall on the mountains of Stara Planina, he is ready to put his ideas to the test. He is ready to build a house that will not just survive the winter, but conquer it. He is ready to build a house that will be a beacon of hope for his village, a testament to the power of human ingenuity, a symbol of a new way of living in harmony with the earth. Part 2. The work of building the new house began on November 1st, 1885. The site that Stefan had chosen was on a small south-facing slope at the edge of the village. He had selected this particular plot on September 25th, after weeks of careful observation and measurement. The slope faced exactly 15 degrees east of true south, an orientation that would maximize solar gain during the winter months. The site was at an elevation of 850 meters above sea level, sheltered from the harsh north winds by the natural topography of the mountain. It was a site that was exposed to the winter sun, but sheltered from the prevailing winds by a stand of tall pine trees. The first task was to dig the foundations, a long, arduous process that was done by hand, with picks and shovels. The foundations were dug deep, more than a meter into the ground, down to the solid bedrock. The excavation was completed on November 8th, revealing bedrock at a depth of 1.2 meters. Stefan had calculated that this depth would place the foundation below the frost line, which in this region extended to approximately 90 centimeters. The foundation trench was 60 centimeters wide, designed to support walls that would be 50 centimeters thick at the base. This was a departure from the traditional practice of building on shallow foundations, but Stefan knew that a deep foundation was essential for his new design. The earth itself would become part of the thermal mass of the house, a giant underground heat sink that would help to regulate the temperature of the living space. Once the foundations were dug, the work of building the walls began. This was the heart of Stefan's new design, the part of the house that would make it different from all the other houses in the village. The walls were to be built of a new composite material that Stefan had developed over the summer, a material that he called solar clay. The formula, which he had perfected on August 15th after numerous experiments, consisted of 60% clay, 20% sand, 15% chopped straw, and 5% crushed charcoal by volume. The clay came from a deposit near the river, excavated on August 5th. The sand was sourced from a quarry 5 kilometers away, transported on August 12th. The straw was from the summer wheat harvest, collected on July 28th. The charcoal was made from oak wood, burned in a controlled pit on August 8th, and ground to a fine powder on August 10th. The idea was simple. The dark-colored walls would absorb more of the sun's heat than the traditional light-colored walls, and they would store that heat in their massive thermal mass. The work was slow and painstaking. The clay had to be mixed by hand in a large wooden trough with just the right amount of water. The straw had to be chopped into small pieces and mixed in with the clay. The charcoal had to be ground into a fine powder and added to the mixture. The resulting solar clay was then packed into wooden forms, layer by layer, to create the thick, massive walls of the house. Each layer had to be allowed to dry for several days before the next layer could be added. It was a process that required patience, skill, and a deep understanding of the properties of the materials. As the walls slowly rose, the house began to take shape. It was a simple, rectangular structure with a low-pitched roof and a large, south-facing wall that was almost entirely made of glass. This was another radical departure from the traditional design. The traditional houses of the village had small windows to minimize heat loss, but Stefan's new design was based on the principle of solar gain. The large, south-facing windows would act like a giant solar collector, capturing the heat of the winter sun and trapping it inside the house. The heat would then be absorbed by the massive thermal mass of the walls and the floor and released slowly at night, keeping the house warm even when the sun had gone down. The windows themselves were a marvel of modern technology. They were double-glazed with 2 panes of glass separated by a small air gap. This created an insulating layer that was far more effective than the single-paned windows of the traditional houses. The glass had been brought in from the city at great expense on the back of a mule. The other villagers had scoffed at the extravagance, but Stefan knew that the windows were a crucial part of his design. They were the key to unlocking the power of the sun. The roof of the house was also a departure from the traditional design. The traditional houses had steep-pitched roofs to shed the heavy snows of winter, but Stefan's new design had a low-pitched roof with a large overhang on the south side. The overhang was designed to do 2 things: to shade the south-facing windows from the high summer sun, keeping the house cool in the summer, and to allow the low winter sun to penetrate deep into the house, warming the interior in the winter. The roof was to be covered with a thick layer of turf, another traditional building material that had been used in the Balkans for centuries. The turf would provide an extra layer of insulation, and it would also help to absorb the rain and the melting snow. As the house neared completion, the other villagers began to take notice. They had watched the construction with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. They had never seen a house built like this before. They had never seen walls made of dark-colored clay. They had never seen windows so large. They had never seen a roof so flat. They were not sure what to make of it. Some thought that Stefan was a genius, a man who was ahead of his time. Others thought that he was a fool, a man who was wasting his time and his money on a crazy, impractical dream. But Stefan was not deterred by their skepticism. He was a man with a vision, and he was determined to see it through. He worked from dawn to dusk, his body aching, his hands raw, his mind focused on a single goal: to finish the house before the first heavy snows of winter. He was in a race against time, a race against the elements, a race against the doubts and the fears of his own community. Finally, on December 15, 1885, the house was finished. It was a simple, elegant structure, a perfect fusion of traditional and modern design. The dark, massive walls of solar clay gave it a solid, earthy feel, a sense of permanence, of a deep connection to the land. The large, south-facing windows gave it a light, airy feel, a sense of openness, of a connection to the sky. The turf roof, with its covering of green grass, made it seem as if the house had grown out of the mountainside itself. Stefan stood back and looked at his creation, his heart filled with a mixture of pride and trepidation. He had done it. He had built his dream house. He had built a house that was designed to work in harmony with the sun and the earth, a house that was designed to be a self-sufficient, sustainable home. But the real test was yet to come. The real test would be the winter. The real test would be to see if his house could truly stay warm with almost no fuel. As the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, Stefan and Elena moved into their new home. They lit a fire in the small, efficient stove that was the only source of heat in the house. They sat in the large, open living space, the light from the fire dancing on the dark, massive walls. They looked out at the snow-covered landscape through the large, south-facing windows. They waited. They waited for the winter to come. They waited to see if their house would be a sanctuary or a tomb. Part 3. The first few weeks in the new house were a revelation. The winter of 1885 to 1886 began with a ferocity that reminded everyone of the previous year. Stefan had installed a thermometer on December 16th, a precision instrument that he had ordered from a scientific supply company in Belgrade. He kept a detailed log, recording temperatures 3 times daily, at 6 a.m., 2 p.m., and 10 p.m. On December 18th, the outside temperature was minus 12 degrees Celsius, while the inside temperature was a comfortable 19 degrees. On December 20th, outside minus 15, inside 18 degrees. On December 21st, outside minus 18, inside 17 degrees. The first major snowstorm arrived on December 22nd, blanketing the village in a thick layer of white. By January 5th, the temperature had plummeted to minus 20 degrees Celsius and held there for a week. The wind, a constant biting presence, howled down from the mountain peaks. In the other houses of the village, the fires burned day and night, consuming precious firewood at an alarming rate. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, but in Stefan's house, it was a different world. The small, efficient stove, which he had designed himself based on a German model, was lit for only a few hours each evening, from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. The rest of the time, the house was heated by the sun. On clear, sunny days, the temperature inside the house would rise to a comfortable 20 degrees Celsius, even when the temperature outside was well below freezing. The large, south-facing windows flooded the living space with light and warmth. The dark, massive walls of solar clay soaked up the heat, their surface warm to the touch. At night, when the temperature outside plunged, the house would slowly release the heat that it had stored during the day. The temperature would drop, but it would never fall below a livable 15 degrees Celsius. The house was a giant thermal battery, a self-regulating system that maintained a stable, comfortable temperature with a fraction of the fuel that was used in the other houses. Stefan kept a meticulous log, recording the temperatures inside and outside the house, the amount of firewood he used, the hours of sunshine. His calculations showed remarkable efficiency. On January 2nd, 1886, he recorded that he had used only 8 kilograms of firewood in the previous 24 hours, compared to the 35-40 kilograms that his neighbors were burning daily. On January 10th, he calculated that the thermal mass of his walls was storing approximately 15,000 kilojoules of energy during sunny days. On January 15th, he measured the surface temperature of the interior walls at 22 degrees Celsius at 4 p.m., dropping to only 18 degrees by 8 a.m. the next morning, demonstrating the slow, steady release of stored heat. The data confirmed what he already knew in his heart. His design worked. It worked even better than he had dared to hope. His house became a source of wonder and curiosity in the village. The other villagers, who had been so skeptical, now came to see for themselves. They would stand in the warm, light-filled living space, their faces a mixture of amazement and disbelief. They would touch the warm walls. They would look at the small, unassuming stove. They would shake their heads in wonder. They had never seen anything like it. They had never imagined that a house could be so warm, so comfortable, with so little fire. But the winter was far from over, and Stefan's new design was about to face its greatest test. On January 28, 1886, a new weather pattern set in. The clear, sunny days were replaced by a thick, persistent cloud cover. For a week, the sun did not shine. The sky was a uniform, leaden gray. The temperature dropped even further to a bone-chilling -25 degrees. The wind picked up, driving the snow into deep drifts that blocked the roads and buried the houses. In Stefan's house, the effect was immediate. Without the sun to charge the thermal battery, the temperature began to fall. The walls, which had been so warm to the touch, were now cool. The air, which had been so fresh and clean, was now tinged with the damp chill of the winter. Stefan was forced to keep the fire in the stove burning for longer and longer periods, just to maintain a livable temperature. He was using more firewood than he had anticipated, and his carefully calculated reserves were beginning to dwindle. The house, which had seemed like such a triumph, was now revealing its Achilles heel. Stefan consulted his logbook with growing alarm. On January 29th, with no sunshine for the first day, the interior temperature had dropped from 18 to 16 degrees. On January 30th, the second cloudy day, it dropped to 14 degrees. On January 31st, the third day, it was down to 12 degrees. On February 1st, the fourth day, it had fallen to 10 degrees. The thermal battery was discharging, and there was no sun to recharge it. The specific heat capacity of his solar clay, which he had calculated to be approximately 880 joules per kilogram per degree Celsius, was working against him now. The massive walls, which contained an estimated 25,000 kilograms of material, were slowly but inexorably releasing their stored heat to the cold outside air. It was a solar house, a house that was designed to work in harmony with the sun. But what happened when the sun did not shine? What happened when the sky was covered with clouds for days, for weeks, on end? The crisis came to a head on February 7, 1886. A fierce blizzard, the worst of the winter, swept across the mountains. The wind howled like a banshee. The snow fell in a thick, blinding curtain. The temperature plunged to a record-breaking -35 degrees. The village was completely cut off from the outside world. In Stefan's house, the situation was becoming desperate. The fire in the stove had been burning continuously for 3 days, and the wood pile was almost gone. The temperature inside the house had dropped to 10 degrees Celsius, and it was still falling. The windows, which had been a source of so much warmth and light, were now a source of cold. The double glazing was no match for the extreme cold, and a thin layer of frost was beginning to form on the inside of the panes. The walls, the massive thermal battery that was supposed to keep them warm, were now cold and clammy. The house was losing heat faster than the small stove could produce it. Elena, who had been so proud of her husband, was now filled with fear. She looked at her 2 young children, their faces pale, their bodies shivering under a pile of blankets. She looked at Stefan, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and despair. She had believed in him. She had believed in his dream. But now it seemed that his dream was turning into a nightmare. Stefan was a man on the edge. He had poured his heart and his soul into this house. He had staked his reputation, his family's well-being, on his new design, and now it was failing. He had been so focused on capturing the heat of the sun that he had neglected to consider what would happen when the sun was not there. He had created a house that was perfectly adapted to a sunny winter, but not to a cloudy one. He had made a fatal miscalculation, and now his family was paying the price. As the blizzard raged outside, as the last of the firewood burned in the stove, Stefan was forced to confront the bitter truth. His house was not a sanctuary. It was a trap, a cold, beautiful, and deadly trap. Part 4. The blizzard raged for 3 days and 3 nights. The wind howled, the snow fell, the temperature remained at a bone-chilling -35 degrees. In Stefan's house, the situation was dire. The last of the firewood was gone. The temperature inside the house had dropped to 5 degrees Celsius. The family huddled together in the center of the room, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their bodies shivering uncontrollably. The children were crying, their small, frail bodies no match for the relentless cold. Elena, her face a mask of fear and despair, prayed for a miracle. Stefan was a broken man. He had failed. He had failed his family. He had failed his community. He had been so arrogant, so sure of himself, so convinced that he had all the answers. And now his arrogance had led them to this. He looked at his wife and children, their faces pale, their lips blue with cold. He felt a wave of guilt and despair wash over him, so powerful that it threatened to drown him. But then, as he sat there in the cold, dark house, something shifted inside him. A small, flickering ember of hope, of defiance, began to glow in the depths of his despair. He was a builder, a man who had spent his life working with his hands, a man who knew how to solve problems. He would not give up. He would not let his family freeze to death. He would find a way. He got up and began to pace the room, his mind racing. He had to find a source of heat. He had to find a way to keep the cold at bay, just for a little while longer. He looked at the stove, its cold black metal, a mocking reminder of his failure. He looked at the walls, their cold, clammy surface a testament to his miscalculation. He looked at the windows, their frosted panes a barrier between him and the outside world. And then he saw it. He saw the one thing that he had overlooked, the one thing that he had taken for granted. He saw the earth beneath his feet, the earth that was the foundation of his house, the earth that was a vast, untapped reservoir of heat. He had built his house on a deep foundation, a foundation that went down to the bedrock. He had done this to increase the thermal mass of the house, to create a giant underground heat sink. But he had not realized the full potential of his design. He had not realized that the earth itself could be a source of heat. He remembered reading, in a book he had borrowed from a traveling scholar on June 12, 1885, about the constant temperature of the earth below the frost line. At a depth of 2 meters, the earth maintains a relatively stable temperature of 8 to 12 degrees Celsius year-round, regardless of the air temperature above. This principle, known as geothermal stability, had been used by ancient civilizations for thousands of years. The Romans had built their Hippocaust heating systems partially underground. The Native Americans had built their earth lodges partially submerged. And now, in his moment of greatest need, Stefan finally understood the wisdom of these ancient techniques. He grabbed a pick and a shovel and began to dig. He dug a hole in the center of the floor, a hole that went down through the layers of clay and gravel, down to the dark, moist earth below. The work began at 8 a.m. on February 8th. By noon, he had excavated a pit 1 meter in diameter and 80 centimeters deep. By 4 p.m., he had reached the unfrozen earth at a depth of 1.2 meters. He measured the temperature of the earth at this depth. It was 10 degrees Celsius, a full 45 degrees warmer than the air outside. The work was hard, the ground was frozen, but he was driven by a desperate primal urgency. He then went to the stable, which was attached to the back of the house, and brought in the 2 cows that were the family's most prized possession. The cows, named Mara and Danica, were each approximately 500 kilograms in weight. Stefan knew from his studies that a cow at rest produces approximately 1,500 watts of metabolic heat, equivalent to about 5,000 British thermal units per hour. With 2 cows, that was 3,000 watts of continuous, reliable heat production, roughly equivalent to 3 large oil lamps burning continuously. This was not insignificant. In the confined space of the house, with the doors and windows sealed against the storm, this heat would make a measurable difference. He led them into the living space and tethered them to a post near the pit. The cows, their bodies radiating a gentle, steady warmth, looked around the room with their large, placid eyes, their breath misting in the cold air. He then filled the pit with hot coals from the dying embers of the fire in the stove. He covered the coals with a layer of flat stones and then a layer of green leaves and branches. He then instructed his family to lie down on the floor around the pit, their bodies close together, their heads towards the center. It was a desperate, unconventional solution, a solution born of necessity and intuition, but it worked. The heat from the pit, a gentle, radiant heat, began to warm the floor. The heat from the bodies of the cows, a steady, constant warmth, began to fill the room. The heat from the bodies of the family, huddled together under a mountain of blankets, created a small, localized pocket of warmth in the center of the cold, dark house. It was not much, but it was enough. It was enough to keep the cold at bay. It was enough to keep them alive. For 3 days and 3 nights, they lived like this, a small, huddled island of warmth in a sea of cold. They lived on dried fruit and stale bread. They drank melted snow. They slept in short, fitful bursts. They waited. They waited for the blizzard to end. On the 4th day, the blizzard finally broke. The wind died down, the snow stopped falling, the sun, a pale, watery disk, appeared on the horizon. The world was a sea of white, a vast, silent, frozen landscape. Stefan emerged from the house, his body aching, his mind numb with exhaustion. He looked at the snow-covered mountains, at the buried village, at the pale, winter sun. He had survived. His family had survived. He had faced the worst that the winter could throw at him, and he had won. He had won not because of his clever design, not because of his modern ideas, but because of his connection to the earth, his understanding of the ancient primal forces of nature. He had won because in his moment of greatest need, he had been able to let go of his pride, his arrogance, his intellectual certainty, and to embrace a simpler, more intuitive way of knowing. He had won because he had learned to listen to the wisdom of the earth. Part 5. The winter of 1885 to 1886 was a turning point for Stefan and for his village. The story of how he and his family had survived the great blizzard with almost no fuel spread like wildfire through the mountains. The other villagers, who had once been so skeptical, now looked at him with a new respect, a new admiration. They saw him not as a fool, but as a visionary, a man who had found a way to live in harmony with the harsh, unforgiving environment of the mountains. In the spring, when the snows had melted and the earth had come back to life, a delegation of villagers came to see Stefan. It was April 15th, 1886, a warm, sunny day that seemed to promise renewal and hope. The delegation was led by the village elder, Petar Markovich, a man of 72 who had seen more winters than anyone else in the village. With him were 5 other men, all heads of households, all men who had struggled through the harsh winter, all men who had seen their firewood supplies dwindle to nothing. They asked him to teach them his new building techniques. They asked him to help them renovate their own houses, to make them warmer, more comfortable, more sustainable. Stefan, who had been humbled by his experience, agreed. He spent the summer of 1886 working with his neighbors, sharing his knowledge, his skills, his vision. He taught them how to build with solar clay, how to install double-glazed windows, how to create turf roofs. He taught them how to orient their houses to the sun, how to use the earth as a thermal battery, how to create a home that was not just a shelter, but a living, breathing part of the natural world. Over the next few years, the village was transformed. The first renovated house was completed on September 20th, 1886, belonging to the Jovanovic family. By December 1st, 1886, three more houses had been upgraded. By the spring of 1887, 10 houses had been renovated. By 1888, 20 houses. By 1890, more than half the village had adopted Stefan's techniques. The village's collective firewood consumption dropped from an estimated 450 cubic meters per winter in 1885 to only 180 cubic meters by 1890, a reduction of 60%. The winter mortality rate, which had been as high as 5% in harsh winters like 1884, 1885, dropped to less than 1% by 1890. The old, dark, damp houses were replaced by new, light, airy homes. The air, which had once been thick with the smell of wood smoke, was now clean and fresh. The village became a model of sustainable living, a beacon of hope in a world that was increasingly disconnected from the natural world. Stefan's reputation as a master builder spread far and wide. People came from all over the Balkans to see his work, to learn from him, to be inspired by his vision. He became a teacher, a mentor, a leader. He never forgot the lessons he had learned during the Great Blizzard. He never forgot the humility, the respect, the deep, abiding connection to the earth that had saved him and his family. He continued to experiment, to innovate, to push the boundaries of what was possible. But he always did so with a sense of humility, a sense of reverence for the ancient wisdom of his ancestors, for the timeless, elemental forces of nature. In the year 1905, a young architect from Vienna, on a journey to document the vernacular architecture of the Balkans, visited Stefan's village. His name was Karl Hoffmann, and he was 28 years old. He had left Vienna on May 3, 1905, traveling by train to Belgrade, then by horse and cart through the mountains. He arrived on June 18, 1905, on a warm summer evening. He was amazed by what he saw. He saw a community that was living in harmony with its environment, a community that had found a way to thrive in one of the most challenging landscapes in Europe. He saw houses that were not just beautiful, but also intelligent, houses that were a perfect fusion of form and function, of tradition and innovation. He spent a month in the village, studying the houses, talking to the people, learning from Stefan. He wrote a book about his experiences, a book that was published in Vienna in 1907. The book, which was titled The Solar Houses of Stara Planina, was a sensation. It was translated into a dozen languages, and it inspired a new generation of architects and builders to think differently about the way they designed and built houses. It was the beginning of a new movement, a movement that would come to be known as green architecture, a movement that would change the face of architecture in the 20th century. And so, the legacy of Stefan, the master builder of Stara Planina, lived on. It lived on in the warm, comfortable homes of his village. It lived on in the pages of a young Austrian architect's book. It lived on in the hearts and minds of all who believed that it was possible to live in a way that was both beautiful and sustainable, both modern and timeless, both human and in harmony with the earth.